the VA takes all the potential medical harms we would have been exposed to from the Department of Defense. If the Department of Defense continues to deny that this uranium is harmful to the soldiers, then the VA has to say, we're accepting that science. Because the VA's only intention is to provide medical treatment for illnesses that they know they can subscribe and diagnose. And since nobody's admitting to it, then they can't accept it into their formula. Because these colonels are in the United States Army talking about that we've done a lot of studies saying that the human being can handle natural levels of uranium and much higher doses of natural level of uranium. Like Colonel Daxon is one of the guys who says the human body can sustain higher levels of natural uranium. Perfect. But what they continue to forget that what we're firing over on the battlefield isn't natural. I mean, the very minute you liberate it from the ground, it's not natural anymore. And that's, you know, that's very simple science. And then once you start running it down range with velocity, you don't meet this paradigm these colonels are talking about. You know, I mean, the minute you add velocity to matter, it represents itself as added energy. So their paradigm that I can stand next to natural uranium in its natural state before it goes into an unnatural state of decay, fine. That's the argument they're making. But what we're hurling at these Afghanistan and Vieques, Puerto Rico and Iraq, and where we're, you know, it's been bombed all over Yugoslavia, what we're leaving there is not natural uranium. Sorry, you know. Duh. I mean, these guys are field-grade officers in the Army who are talking like they know what they're talking about, but they're talking about something different.
They've even been firing it off the coast of Washington here in the state.
Right.
Part of your formal training was to attend NBC training.
Right.
Can you tell us what that is and what you went through on that?
Right, Nuclear Biological Chemical School, and basically the way it works, you have a military occupational specialty, which makes me a 91 Whiskey currently, or 91 Bravo, or 91 Alpha, depending on when you served in the military. So I'm a 91 series medic, and then what you do is, you know, if you're a go-getter, you add little additional qualifiers to your MOS. 91 Alpha Papa means I'm an airborne individual. 91 Alpha X-ray means I'm a drill sergeant. 91 Alpha Charlie means I've graduated from Nuclear Biological Chemical School. So I have all three of those skill identifiers. And this particular skill identifier means that out in the battlefield, I'm somebody who you would lean on if you wanted some information about what's occurring in these particular battlefield environments. And what we learn there is we learn about mushroom clouds. We learned that in 1985, by our manuals, we won't use biological agents, but we are prepared to use nuclear preemptively. That was in '85 that's written into my manuals. That's the same year Ronald Reagan shook hands with Gorbachev and said, we're getting out of the arms race. So you can see some, you know, tension there. So what we're learning is that, you know, how to respond to nuclear weapons, you know, how to respond to biological or chemical agents. We learn how to use the equipment to test for the battlefield contaminants. And we learned about heavy-duty signs and symptoms of how can you tell by looking at a human being what they've been exposed to. The military likes to use a term called train the trainer. So after you've graduated from here, maybe you train somebody who can train somebody, and then everybody gets their good training. And that's pretty much what it is. It's signs and symptoms of contaminated exposures and how to survive a contaminated battlefield. That's what we learned there.
So then later when you were a drill sergeant,
Right.
How much of that information did you pass on to your recruits?
Right. This is where I really became aware that they get a manual, and the manual still, it's called a CTT manual, Common Task Training Manual, and the manual they're using now is from 1994 still. It's already 10 years old, and it's the same manual they're still using today in the military. I mean the U.S. Army in particular. And this manual only covers how to respond to a nuclear flash blast mushroom cloud. That's the only thing it talks about in it. And then it talks about some of the chemical agents, the biological agents that you might see on a battlefield, and how to test for signs and symptoms, you know, runny eyes, ears, nose and throat, and what might be the signs and symptoms of a biological or chemical agent. Very rudimentary stuff, and not enough to survive a contaminated battlefield whatsoever, because the real training and basic training is not how to survive a battlefield. It's how to follow orders, say yes a lot, even when you should be saying no. And that's what the programming and the indoctrination is. It's got nothing to do with keeping you alive. It's got to do with power and authority and people beating you down and breaking you down like a, you know, a lot of people like to say the militant order of the Catholic Church, the Jesuits like to do. You know, just bang them down. And then the idea that you bang them down and build them back up But what you build back up is a robot. You don't build a human being back up. You build somebody who says, yes, drill sergeant a lot. And so you take a look at this current conflict we're in, and there's a particular example that I always like to use to illustrate this. In this battle, a number of soldiers left New York as citizen soldiers. They were reservists from military police unit who were firemen and police officers in New York. And they were sent there. Now, the Dutch soldiers were in the area of operation, but we know a lot of these armies are leaving. Like the Polish general has said, the American army is so incompetent that I'm not going to stick around here any longer, and shipped. And the Dutch are kind of saying the same thing, because they were all going there as peacekeepers. They weren't going there to continue the slaughter that we've been participating in. So they're trying to get out of this area, and they Geiger counted this area and found it to be hot, radioactive, and told the American soldiers, hey, we know it's hot, we're sleeping out in a desert. American soldiers are just directed to follow orders. And we have this one little clause that says we can disobey illegal orders, but that's never emphasized. So the soldiers follow orders, go sit in the hot spot, and come home and are contaminated. Very sick, very ill, sent back home real quick so they don't die on that battlefield as combat casualties, number one. Come back home. Luckily, Juan Gonzalez of the New York Daily News says, ooh, gotcha. Gets Colonel Durakovich up in Canada to test him, where they find all the byproducts of these weapons inside these people's blood and urine. And this is a sheer example of what our training is inside a basic training. Don't follow orders, go to jail. That's it. If those guys didn't go in that building, they probably would have been court-martialed and sent to some brig. They did follow orders, and now they'll probably be dead. But the whole indoctrination is just to follow orders, regardless of what's happening, not to survive a contaminated battlefield. You learn that later if you're lucky.
What would be the procedure for if you were in a combat situation and you did come upon a contaminated area and you were following the protocol for dealing with a contaminated area?
Well, great question. I'd like to specifically address it with depleted uranium, because the manuals have addressed depleted uranium prior. And what it says, first of all, I'd like to mention that DU, depleted uranium, had a prior name, and it was DOLRAM. All the military manuals refer to it as DOLRAM, D-U-L-L-R-A-M, which is depleted uranium low-level radioactive material. Well, they so eloquently remove the LLRAM and just call it depleted uranium now, and remove the low-level radiation part of it, uniquely enough. I don't know how they got to go hide that part. I don't know where the science was that allowed them to take those last four parts of the acronym off. So we know that in our manuals, what it says is if you come across an area that was hit with a depleted uranium round, and this, heck, I'm imagining this is still at my website, this particular CTT training, and what they did was they called it an update. Now remember, this manual is very old. They don't mind using old manuals, but the update states that if you end up in a depleted uranium contaminated area, you're to use the NATO marker, which indicates radiation. That's the marker we use, because if you go by an area of allied forces, we speak different languages, so they have universal triangles, which indicate whether it's biologically contaminated, nuclear contaminated, or chemically contaminated. One's yellow, red, and blue. So you take the one that says radiological radiation, and you put that in the area. And what you're supposed to do is if you get a Geiger counter, you find out how far out you're going, and you go, okay, don't cross this line right here. This is where it kicks out to. And you're supposed to post those, even if a depleted uranium round is hit there, which means the military knows that it's hot, because they were telling us education-wise or academically-wise that it's hot. And if you find it, put the radioactive marker up there. And so that's what you're supposed to do when you arrive on a contaminated battlefield, is mark it so that your friends and your foes even, it's all illegal to use this, all internationally, it's illegal to use these things, but we know they're going to get used, and should they get used, we're supposed to put these markers up so everybody in the whole world is aware of what's going on in that area. And we're trained to do that, but I bet you money that you're not seeing any markers anywhere, even on this conflict. But that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's our commitment to humanity, to do that at least.
Do you know of any conflicts that those have ever actually been used in? Because we know that DU has been used in places like, you know, Yugoslavia and even in testing areas like, let's say, down in Puerto Rico, where, you know, they know enough not to let the civilians in there, but
right.
I doubt there's any markers there.
No markers. To mark it would mean we'd have to admit that we got a situation going on. I mean, there's 1.1 billion tons of depleted uranium in America right now that they got to get rid of.
But what's even more alarming is that the McAllister bomb factory in Oklahoma, McAllister, Oklahoma, was applying for relicensing at the NRC in order to be able to continue manufacturing DU weapons. And in order to maintain level 1 status, which they have to do to get relicensed, they must be able to ship 1,600 tons of depleted uranium weapons a day. And altogether, at all 4 bomb factories at any one time, they are allowed by the NRC to have up to 44,000 tons of DU on site. That's 4.5 million Nagasaki bombs.